Fate, Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem chapter 61-62. Difference of opinion. The words of challenge had barely left Drake's mouth before Ash broke into a sprint directly for the pirate. The woman immediately honed in on him and raised her pistols. Ritska was about to call out for him to stop before the clang of steel to his left had his head snap around to the source. Boudica was on the offensive against the knight. The queen was certainly the faster of the two, however the knight apparently had some level of skill as he was albeit barely able to block or counter some of her strikes. Considering that Ash had recognized the armor, it meant that it was another person from his world. In short, the situation had deteriorated rapidly and far faster than he was able to compensate for. Senpai. Mash looked towards him. Orders. Support Ash. He answered immediately. The shielder gave a nod of her head before he turned towards Archer. Help Ryder. Archer grunted, spinning on his heels and shooting off towards the two dueling servants. His hands crackled with blue energy before two Dao swords manifested in each of them. Ritska barely had time to do a double take before an earth-shaking crash echoed out and brought his attention towards Havel. The berserker having slammed his rather large club into the ground where the other archer had been, the man back-pedaled away from the berserker as Havel ripped the club from the ground, spinning clockwise and swinging the club towards the man. The green-haired man adjusted his staff in his hands as the club closed in on him, thrusting the top of the staff at a slight angle downwards and redirecting the club into the dirt. The berserker tilted their head before reassessing the man. The servant in front of him couldn't match his strength. Havel could tell that already, but he had been able to use Havel's own strength against him and send the club just off course with a slight movement. It was marginally impressive for such a small man. I don't know how I should feel that you immediately went for me. The archer wryly spoke as twirled the staff in his hands and swung the top of it towards Havel's head. The berserker raised his shield again and took the impact before continuing his charge at the man. I personally don't want to kill you. Don't want to kill. Havel growled out. The archer paused and raised an eyebrow at him. But, Curran, Mies. Well, I wouldn't say enemies. The archer shrugged, but it is true that we are on opposing sides right now. A sigh escaped him. I don't suppose I could convince you not to kill me. We'll see, Havel ominously growled out as he adjusted the club in his hands, tightening his grip and advancing forwards. Despite being much slower than the archer, Havel had the clear edge in endurance. Every strike the man attempted against him was either blocked or tanked by the armor. Although that might have also been because the man was holding back, Havel noticed that the man had yet to properly use the sling he had seen earlier. That might also have been because he was at such close range, but Havel wasn't entirely sure. For a man who dressed as a farmer, he was surprisingly skilled at combat. The saber did his best under the circumstances, although the circumstances weren't great for him. Boudica had the edge in strength and speed. Although that much was true of many creatures in Lordran. Raising his kite shield, Boudica's sword slammed into it while he thrust towards her leg. The rider punched the sword off course with her shield before kicking off the ground into the air, swinging her sword so the tip was pointed towards the saber. The blade glowed a brilliant yellow before it burst into life. Dozens of thin beams of light exploded from the sword towards the saber. The man let out a small grunt as he threw his body to the side, the beams of light crashing into the ground near his last spot and leaving scorch marks in the wood. You keep going for wounding hits. Boudica pointed out with a small frown. Why? Because I truly do not mean you harm. The saber replied in his still soft-spoken voice, returning to his feet. You do not seem to be of the indecent sort, and from what I could hear your quest is a noble one. But you have your debt to repay. Boudica quickly gathered. You owe her. I do. Saber nodded, but I will only seek to defend her. Ending your lives is not something I would do. He abruptly swung his shield to his left, parrying away Kancho which had been aimed at his ribs. Archer span on his heel and swung Bakuya towards the man's chest in a backhanded swipe. The saber raised his own sword to block the move. Fighting without a willingness to kill might get you killed. Archer coldly remarked. Others aren't as honorable as you. Evidently. Saber remarked, sweeping the blade up and knocking Archer's sword away from him before moving into for a charge. He then stopped and jumped back when Boudica made a slash at him. Although it is still the principle. It's a nice principle. Boudica admitted as she tensed herself, giving him an apologetic look. and you don't seem to be a bad person, but we do have to protect our master." "That is understandable." The saber nodded, helmet quickly darting between the rider and the archer slowly pacing around to his side. "I imagine this is where our conversation ends." "Indeed," Archer remarked, kicking off the ground and shooting towards the saber in a blur of movement. The man raised his shield to cover his head, causing Bakuya to skate along its surface and go skywards. Archer reversed Kancho in his grip and made a slash towards his leg. The saber thrust his sword in for a block, the swords locked against each other. A beam of golden light struck the saber in the shoulder of his sword arm. The man released a small grunt as he recoiled from the blast, darting his head up just in time for Boudica to land a two-footed kick into his chest. The saber was knocked away and onto his back while Boudica used the force of the kick to flip through the air and land back on her feet. Saber released a small grunt as he quickly rolled back onto his feet, immediately finding Archer swinging towards his head. The saber blocked the first strike and then moved into a slash. Archer found that he wasn't having much difficulty against the saber. Despite being of the three main classes, the man wasn't as strong as others. While Archer himself would never be one to underestimate another servant, he himself didn't look that good compared to other servants in terms of stats. The saber in front of him was cliché for lack of a better word. His fighting style was basic and rigid. The man had adequate skill to pass for a soldier but nothing exceptional. Saber, meanwhile, found the swordsman in front of him to be something fearsome. The man's fighting style was virtually non-existent. It was as if he could already tell what moves he was going to make before he made them. That was without the woman to deal with as well. He barely had a moment to block the man's latest attack before a shadow passed over his head. His eyes darted up just in time for him to catch an axe kick to the head from the woman. The saber stumbled backwards as the back of Boudica's leather boot slammed into the top of his head. The man released a pained gasp as his guard broke. Boudica was quick to take advantage of the opening. The moment her feet made contact with the ground, they threw her knee forwards and slammed it into the man's gut. A wheeze came from behind the helmet as the strike lifted the saber off his feet briefly. Archer appeared behind the saber as he was in the air, swinging his leg around and slamming his shin into the back of the man's head. The kick shot the knight's body into the ground with a heavy thud. Earth and wood were upturned by the impact as the saber lay there for a few moments. Spinning Kancho around, Archer reversed the grip and held it pointed down towards the saber's head. Boudica leveled him with an unimpressed look. "Do you really think that master is going to be pleased about killing him? He is a hostile servant." "He wasn't that hostile and you know it." She sighed. "Besides, he didn't actually try to kill either of us." "HMPH. Archer grunted, "That just makes him foolish." Boudica continued to stare at him. The tanned servant let out a sigh as he lowered the weapon. "Very well, but it is on your head if he does something." Mash grit her teeth as the cannonball smashed into her shield. The cloud of smoke hid her away from view as Drake looked to prepare another volley. The captain's eyes narrowed as the smoke began to move before Ash burst through it. Drake's flintlock snapped up and she fired off a single round towards the servant. Ash barely released a grunt as the bullet slammed into his shoulder and went straight through. He'd suffered worse anyway. Drake ducked low when the greatsword swung through the air above her head, shaving off a few strands of hair. Blue eyes locked onto emerald green, the latter coldly glaring down at her before the owner twisted the sword in their hand and swung downwards towards her body. Drake rolled backwards, kicking up with her foot and batting Ash's sword off course with it burying itself in the ground next to her. The woman rolled back to her feet and leveled both her flintlocks at the unkindled's head. Ash remained unperturbed as Drake heard the howl of wind just before the sword exploded. The blast of wind had her close her eyes and debris was thrown about the field. Ash released his grip on the sword and rushed forwards. Drake cleared her eyes just in time to see the man pull his left hand back and throw a punch at her gut. Drake smirked. He was playing in her territory now. The woman released her grip on the pistols and gripped his wrist, stopping the punch in its tracks and wrenching Ash forwards. The saber stumbled with the pull and into perfect range for Drake to slam her forehead into his nose. The crunch of bone indicated the damage, soon followed by a grunt from the saber as he recoiled. The pirate didn't waste the advantage and pressed on, flipping her pistol in her right hand and swinging it like a hammer. The grip struck Ash's jaw and snapped his head to the side. Drake flipped the pistol around again and leveled it at his head. Emerald-colored eyes snapped to her, his right hand clamped around her wrist and forced the gun to aim high. the crack of gunfire barely fazed the undead as the bullet whisked just above his head. Swinging his left arm upwards, he slammed his armored fist into Drake's side. The woman released a hiss of pain from the punch. Ash jerked his wrist and caused Drake to drop the flintlock to the ground before pulling his left hand back and throwing a punch towards her face. Drake caught the fist with her free hand, clamping her fingers around his knuckles and struggling as they two swiftly degraded into a shoving match. "Can't help but feel this is a little personal for you," Drake joked, smirking at the cold expression on the unkindled's face. "Do you hate fun?" "This isn't fun," he answered back, taking a single step forwards and pushing Drake back. "This is indulgence. A world on the verge of collapse with you in the position to do something about it, and this is your response. You say that as if people have to instantly drop everything," Drake shouted back, halting her retreat and digging in. Both Ash and her arms began to strain and shake from the force they were pushing against each other. "I don't see why I shouldn't enjoy myself in this type of situation." "Enjoyment?" Ash hissed, his eyes burning with anger. "What enjoyment is there to be had in watching the deaths of others? It's not about them dying. It's about me looking out for me." The pair both drew their heads back and slammed them into each other, not giving any ground. "People gotta have desires. So what if I'm living life so I can fulfill mine? What about a sense of duty?" Ash growled, "It's a world of potential and you'd let it go to waste." "Hey," Drake huffed, "I'd exploit it before I let it go to waste. Like I'm doing here. And you take pride in this." Ash drew his head back while Drake did the same, bruises present on both their foreheads. "This is where you derive fun." Ash spat the word venomously at the pirate. Drake's own eyes started to ignite. Different strokes. The pair butted heads again, for different folks. The Capitan's face turned into a snarl. "What? You think because you're some honorable guy everyone else has to be too? Can't all get our jollies from saving the world?" "Saving?" Ash barked out incredulously. "I exist to kill." He sneered. "What could I ever save?" Gripping tightly around her hands, he pulled her off her feet and threw her towards the nearest building. Drake released a small squawk of surprise before she crashed into the wooden wall, bending the planks inwards. The saber stomped towards her. "The freedom of choice I could never have." He reared his fist back. "The world I'll never see." Then threw it down towards her head. "And this is how you treat it." Drake caught his fist before it made contact with her. The woman opened her eyes and stared up at the saber with a narrowed look before she apparently came to a realization. "I see," she muttered lowly before kicked the saber in the chest. Ash released a grunt as he stumbled backwards. The woman slowly rose to her feet. "Can't understand what you've never experienced, huh?" "What?" Ash blinked. "What do you? People enjoy life in different ways." Drake shrugged with a blank expression, her lips soon pulling into a faint smile. "This is how I enjoy mine. Living for the moment." Then stared at him with an expectant look. "You ever done that?" Ash stared at her before a tight frown came to his face. As if this way of living could ever be worth it. Mash rushed out of the cloud of smoke, snapping her head around to quickly see Ritska stood off to the side. The Shielder's servant gave him a single nod before she turned her attention back towards Ash and Drake as the two looked ready to get into another brawl. Mash was starting to get concerned at the aggression that Ash had shown, which was quickly becoming dangerous towards the captain. Even if she had the Holy Grail, there would only be so much punishment she could take. She broke into a sprint towards the duo, shield gripped tightly in one hand as she cleared the distance in a few seconds. She was still too slow to act when Drake slammed into Ash's waist, tackling the undead to the ground before cocking her fist back and slamming it into his face. The saber grunted with pain and raised his own hand in a punch, catching the woman in the jaw and pushing her off him. Ash quickly rolled on top of her and clasped both his hands together above his head in a hammer strike. Drake threw up her own arms in a block as the saber struck her with the punch. "Ash-san!" Mash cried out as she slid to a halt next to the servant and grabbed his shoulder, pulling him off the captain and to his feet. "We can't hurt her too badly. She'll live." Ash grunted as he stared down at her. The woman spat out a glob of blood before giving a crimson smile. "Ha!" She cackled, rolling to her feet and cracking her neck. "It'll take more than you to take me down, boy." "How many more?" Another voice answered out. Drake blinked and looked behind her to see Archer with his twin swords staring at her impassively. The woman looked over his shoulder to see the red-haired rider stood over the knight, her sword pointed towards the man's neck in an obvious gesture for him not to move. Whoa! The green-haired archer let out a small shout of surprise as Havel's club smashed into the ground near his feet, burying itself nearly a foot into the earth. The man looked up just in time to see the berserker phase his shield out of existence and clasp his other hand onto the dragon tooth and reverse his grip on the handle. Oh dear me! Havel ripped the weapon upwards, tearing away the ground beneath the archer's feet and sending him tumbling through the air with a shocked expression. The archer crashed face first into the ground a few meters from Drake, raising his head and giving a strained smile. I think I've almost got it. The large boot of Havel slammed into the ground next to his head. The shadow fell over the servant although the berserker made no further moves. The archer pursed his lips and gave a single nod. Yep. I'm beat. Yeah, Drake whistled, shaking her head. I'd say you beat us. She sniffed, rubbing her nose and clearing away the blood dribbling from it. Pretty nasty punch you got there too, she remarked, nodding to Ash. The saber continued to glare at her. Yeesh, someone's too high-strung. Perhaps you should not have attacked them, Captain. The knight spoke up from his crouched position, Boudica's sword still resting on his shoulder. They only wanted the best. Drake shrugged. It's boring though. A sigh escaped her, but can't do much about it now. Her eyes turned to the largest building before her face flattened out. Hope you haven't ruined the rum barrels. So, Ritska looked around, then back to the captain, the Grail. Huh. Drake blinked and looked at him. Oh right, yeah. Victor go the spoils and all that. Her hand went for her chest. Ritska's cheeks became dusted with a slight redness as he looked away. Here we go, the woman exclaimed as she pulled the golden chalice from her bosom. Shame, but I guess if it's either this or my life, ain't worth it. She shrugged, throwing it over to Ritska. The boy let out a slight gasp as he juggled the grail in his hands before clutching it to his chest. Grail secure. Nice work, Fujimaru-kun. Roman's voice came through the communicator. Singularity solved in record time. Huh. That's weird. What is? The singularity shows no signs of collapse. Roman's voice came through slightly puzzled. Readings haven't so much as changed a bit. What? Olga's equally puzzled voice came through. How can that be possible? They're holding the grail in their hands. I might be able to explain. The green-haired archer spoke out from his position on the ground. Havel stared at him before taking a single step backwards. Thank you. The man nodded to him as he quickly got to his feet and dusted himself off. Just because you're looking for a grail, doesn't mean that there's only one grail here. What is that cryptic speech you're giving? Roman's voice was slightly frustrated. Are you trying to sound wiser than you actually are? That's a little painful. The archer chuckled, but I'm being serious here. He pointed to the grail in Ritska's hands. That might indeed be the grail, but I'm afraid it isn't the one you're looking for. What? Olga scoffed. That doesn't even make sense. The only other explanation is that it was the grail that naturally manifested in this. Oh. The archer nodded. See. I can sense that wisdom in your voice, which no doubt carries an air of elegance. A pleased hum escaped him. You are, without a doubt, Abishag. All right, no. Roman's face popped up. Ritska blinked at the expression on the man, which looked like second-hand embarrassment. Stop flirting with everyone, woman, you can hear. What is wrong with you? I don't see what the issue is. The archer gave a hearty smile in response. It's not as if I could be mistaken. He looked away from Romani and towards Olga stood behind him, her face contorted in a bewildered expression. I can see it now, that radiant youthful visage. You are most certainly Abishag. What? Olga sputtered. Who? Don't be so coy. The archer chuckled. There is no way you are not. Boudica smacked him on the back of the head, causing him to let out a startled gasp. The red-haired woman held a flat look on her face. None of that now. She sighed. An Abishag. You realize you may as well have just announced your true name to everyone. No, he paused, wincing. Once again I have been led astray by a beautiful woman. Very funny. She looked him up and down with a frown. Although you aren't what I would expect from Adonijah. The archer and Roman both let out heavy coughs in response and fixed the writer with equally incomprehensive looks. The woman blinked at the sudden attention. What? A tight frown came to her face. What is it? Adonijah. The archer replied with a slightly strangled voice. That's not what I was expecting. Caught flat-footed. Roman shook his head. Although given that rather odd display, I can assume you aren't Adonijah. He paused, I don't know if he could even be summoned as a heroic spirit. Then who? Boudica paused, then looked down at the sling on the man's waist and then back at him. Oh. Yes, never mind. I see it now. That's good. Ritska nodded, because I don't. You wouldn't think so, wouldn't you? Roman sighed. In truth, I suspected it when he almost let the same name slip at the docks but wasn't certain until just now. You're King David of Israel, aren't you? Ha ha. The archer scratched the back of his neck. Well, I am indeed. Although I do prefer to just be David. He waved the staff meaningfully. I like being a simple shepherd sometimes. You're a king. Ritska looked the man up and down with dubious expression. King David of Israel. Yes. David nodded, then frowned at the strange looks he received. What? Is something on my face? Perhaps they were not expecting one of authority to act as casual as you do. The knight remarked from his spot on the ground. Might I stand? Huh. Ritska looked to him and blinked in realization. Oh, right. Why yeah. My thanks. The man nodded, rising to his feet. I am Oscar of Astora. Archer blinked, furrowing his brows. He rubbed his forehead. You died in an asylum. Indeed. Oscar nodded. You seem surprised to learn of this. Wait. Olga pushed Roman aside and occupied the screen. You have knowledge of his history now that his true name has been revealed. Barely. Boudica admitted with a wince. It's blurred but there's a little bit. Her eyes slowly turned towards Havel. A little with him too, but it's nowhere near as specific as other servants. Ritska furrowed his brows. Does this mean we won't be in the dark anymore when encountering other servants? No. Archer shook his head. As far as Saber goes, he gestured to Ash. I still draw up a blank, and thinking of the others back at Chaldea offers little in regard to their own history. Perhaps the throne is updating its information due to the sudden influx of heroic spirits. Roman guessed, we're talking about hundreds of legends suddenly appearing from another world, unless something in this singularity is causing it. Oscar remained silent. We can worry about it later. Olga dismissed. For now what concerns me is this talk of multiple grails. I ain't explaining anything until I get another drink in my hands. Drake commented with a tired look on her face as she made her way to the remains of the pub. Stepping through the large hole in the wall, she quickly took in the damage to the interior before shrugging to herself. Well, it don't look that bad, so I guess it's fine for now. She turned around and waved to the others. Come on. Nothing like drinking after a fight. The pirates around here love repeating the story. David remarked as he pulled a chair out for himself, so I'll give you the quick version of it. Please do. Ritska nodded to the man, because I'm very confused right now. He stared at the grail in his hands before placing it on the table in front of him. Mash nodded her head to his left while the other servants were gathered around. Ash pointedly kept his distance from Drake, still staring at the woman with a blank expression. Well, it started before you arrived. David chuckled. Apparently it was quite chaotic, something to do with Atlantis. What? Ritska sputtered in shock. And Poseidon threatening to flood the world. He continued on, ignoring the shocked looks from the other servants. It seems as though the captain managed to save the world as a normal human being, and therefore the grail of this era. He pointed towards the golden chalice on the table, chose her to be its owner. Then there came another grail to cause another distortion. Hey. Drake shrugged as she poured herself another drink. Some guy calling himself Poseidon and messing with the oceans ain't something I can really tolerate as a sailor. Pausing, a frown came to her face, plus he was an annoying bastard. Archer snorted. Not exactly a reason why one would fight a lord of the ocean. Oscar commented as he leaned back into his chair. However, I suppose I could understand the desire to survive. Well, yeah. Drake nodded, then gestured to the grail. Also he had some nice shit on him. Never run out of booze with that nice little cup. And there goes any sense of noble aim. Oscar lamented, shaking his head. Frankly, your rapacious desires are quite frightening at times. That is one word for it. Ash muttered from where he leaned against the wall. Havel grunted in agreement. So that means this isn't the grail we're after. Ritska surmised, staring at the cup. We're looking for another grail then. So it seems. Romani scratched his forehead. Although to think that Captain Drake would best Poseidon, that's something outlandish right there. In any event, it is best we leave that grail with the captain. Olga sighed. If it is the grail that naturally belongs in this era, then removing it would worsen the damage of the singularity. Alright. Ritska shrugged, turning to the captain, here. You can have it back. Really? Drake blinked in surprise, not gonna keep it, At the shake of the head, the woman shrugged and took the grail back. The shape shifted until it resembled a tankard made of pure gold. Well, your loss, I guess. Then where does this leave us? Boudica asked, looking around to the master. If this isn't the grail we're after, then the grail we seek is somewhere out on the ocean. Ah, Ritska bit his lip. Yes, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Afraid so. Romani nodded along. It means we'll have to go out exploring the rest of this ocean. Sure. Drake offered immediately, can leave tomorrow morning. Everyone's attention, except David and Oscar, who both let out knowing sighs, fell onto the crimson pink-haired captain. Sounds like fun. Really? Ritska almost gaped at her. Is that alright? Didn't you say this ocean was also fun, Drake-san? Mash inquired with a rather shocked expression. Why would you want to help us? Sounds like it'll be a good time, so why not? Drake shrugged, grinning. Besides, always an opportunity for more treasure. You're just a creature of greed, aren't you? Ash accused with narrowed eyes, arms crossed in front of him. There's no sense of purpose behind your actions beyond them being a flight of fancy. Yep, Drake admitted unashamedly, that's me. Living for the moment. You. Hey, Ash. Ritska cut him off, getting to his feet and giving the unkindled a strained expression. Can you, wait outside for a moment, please? Ash stared at Ritska before his eyes flicked back to Drake, giving a light huff. He nodded his head and turned away from the table, quickly stepping through the hole he had put in the wall and out into the port side area. Ritska watched him go before letting out a quiet sigh, turning back to Drake. Sorry about that ease, I don't know, he honestly replied, but you'll really help us. Don't see why not. Drake shrugged, been a bit bored here anyway, so I may as well. She looked towards David and Oscar. These two will come with, they're part of my crew anyway. I was under the impression it was more a debt on his part. Boudica pointed to Oscar. And it is. Drake nodded, he is repaying it by being a part of my crew. Oscar let out a heavy sigh in response, his head falling into his left hand. Yes, the captain made that quite clear. I suppose I should be thankful your ship was nearby at the time. Telling me. Drake wryly retorted, if I knew your pal was going to blow himself, and a whole island, up, I would have never stuck around as long as I did. Her hand rubbed her left ear, damn near went deaf. Wait, Ritska turned his attention to Oscar. Bomb mentioned that an island blew up, that was you. No, not me. Oscar denied instantly, I have not the power for such a feat, that belonged to another. However, the destruction of the island also means he has likely died as well. We were both originally summoned onto the island and were waiting for rescue when we were set upon by another servant. His voice changed to hold a tinge of melancholy to it. I suppose it is fortunate that the explosion which killed my compatriot also likely killed them. Sorry. Ritska offered with a genuine look of sadness. Oscar's helmet looked towards him and nodded once. Your sympathies are appreciated, but undead are more comfortable with the idea of dying than you would consider normal. A light chuckle escaped him. It is the notion of dying sane which is quite extraordinary to me. Well, Ritska shrugged, getting used to the idea of some servants being used to dying more often than they should. He muttered under his breath and turned his attention back to Drake. So. I guess I should thank you for your help. Drake shrugged, just a flight of fancy, although with luck we'll get some treasures out of it. She exclaimed with a beaming smile. Let's celebrate it with a drink. But I'm under AG. Drink. You are concerned. Ash looked over his shoulder as Oscar emerged from the hole in the wall. The Astoran knight moved until he was stood next to him. Apologies, I have not yet asked for your name. I am Ash of. Ash paused. I suppose Ash of Lothric. Lothric. Oscar hummed to himself. A land of the future, no. Well, future for me anyway. It still bared the name Lordran while I walked the lands. I met another who was from such a time. Ash admitted, Solaire of Astora. Another knight of Astora. Oscar spoke in a pleased tone. I hope he was an honorable man. He was. Ash admitted, a fleeting smile appeared on his face, although he was also a warrior of sunlight, like myself. It would have saddened me if he were not of the decent sort. A warrior of sunlight. Oscar nodded to himself. I have heard of the order, they are good men in a dreary land. The pair fell into a silence before the knight spoke again. I know why the woman vexes you, I hold similar misgivings about her. It is, Ash clicked his tongue and looked away, it is not. It's a choice you cannot describe or fathom. Oscar admitted, I suppose we undead cannot really follow such a way of life, so we cannot truly understand why anyone would. Reaching his hands up to his helmet, he slowly removed it from his head. Curly wheat blonde hair and pale blue eyes were the first things that were revealed. Oscar's face was relatively young, although still looked marginally older than Ash with his slightly chiseled features. I cannot ask you to make merry with the captain, but I would ask you consider your position and those around you. Making enemies where none exist will do you no good. I know that. Ash snapped back quickly, his expression tight before he reached up and rubbed his face. I know that, but does it not anger you? A freedom that we could never have being used for personal greed. I would not say that she abuses her freedoms. Oscar frowned, but she does not use them as I would, and that she is purely motivated by her own desires does trouble me, but she is not like us. The consequences of her avarice are not the same as if we were to attempt something similar. Ash grimaced and looked away. No, they aren't. He remained silent for a few more moments before his focus flickered back to the saber. Was there ever a point where you had a desire that wasn't related to your duty? Oscar blinked at the question, soon pursing his lips and looking down. Perhaps there was one, once. He shrugged, a sad smile came to his face, but such things do not matter anymore. The saber raised an eyebrow at the unkindled, what of you? There was one time, Ash admitted quietly, but I then considered it my new duty to fulfill. You need to speak with Ash. Olga opened with as Ritska moved to the corner of the room, Mash followed after him. The sounds of the cheering pirates going off behind him had him cringe slightly at the volume. That was an outburst we cannot afford. I know that. Ritska nodded, frowning, but I don't know what's the matter. I suppose that Drake might seem a bit crazy, but he came out of nowhere with that stuff. It obviously wasn't nowhere. Olga countered, crossing her arms. Get him to control his outbursts if you are to be traveling with Drake. His own feelings on the matter cannot endanger the objective. I'll do my best. Good. Olga huffed before narrowing her eyes at the master, and no drinking. The communicator shut off with Ritska and Mash left blinking at it for a few seconds before the pair looked at each other. Does she think I would? He asked honestly. Mash opened her mouth to reply before she paused and slowly closed it. Her expression cycled through to one of minor confusion before her focus turned towards Drake. I think she is concerned that you might be pressured into it, senpai. Mash answered, Drake-san does seem like the type to not think things through so far. Telling me. Ritska sighed. What do you think is wrong with Ash? Mash blinked before frowning, a slightly anxious look came upon her. I'm not sure, senpai. Drake-san's words didn't make sense to me either, but I don't know why Ash-san got angry about them. She furrowed her brows with a concerned glint entering her eyes. Do you think it's personal for him? I don't know. Ritska muttered to himself. Might also be a cultural thing, but we won't know until we ask. The saber, I think his name was Oscar. He said he wasn't a fan of it either. He was working with Drake-san though, wasn't he? Mash pointed out, but he also said he had a debt to her because she saved him. Not going to gather around the others? David asked as he approached Havel. The berserker was stood in the corner of the room with his arms crossed. The helmet moved slightly so that it was facing the archer, the green-haired man appearing blazed approaching the somewhat intimidating man. Or is it another problem with the people in question? He quizzed. Gray, Ed, Havel grunted in response. No. Sense of duty. David hummed in response. If Captain Drake maintained a sense of duty as you put it, would you have overlooked the greed? Havel slowly shook his head. Can't do both. He raised his right arm and tapped against his helmet, the sound releasing a heavy echo. Duty keeps sane. Gray. Ed can cause you to lose self. David raised an eyebrow. Are we speaking in a spiritual sense or in a mental sense? Mind, become. Distract. Ted, Havel explained. Soul, refill, CTS, self. Hollow, souls are, base. Powerful, souls are, bright, but dutiful. A menacing growl escaped the helmet. Xandro was a worm. Covetous. I saw souls of his followers. Giving a slow blink in response, David quickly caught the meaning. Was Xandro a god then? God of greed, Havel sneered. Some turned into monsters. Sounds horrible. David shrugged. I'm not personally against a person having desires myself. I think everyone has them. He frowned. Do you not also have personal wishes of your own? I have wish. Havel slowly nodded his head. Also, duty, must, never, lose, ght of, duty, or, lose, self. David let out a small noise of understanding. I was curious why Oscar seemed uncomfortable around the captain. A cultural thing relating to greed then. Fulfill your desires but keep them in moderation. Havel grunted in affirmation. That's a nice outlook. David admitted, although I also had ambitions of my own, they were also my duty. I wanted to build a temple to God. He paused for a few moments before giving a slight shrug. Although I am also a servant of God, so you could say it is my duty to build temples to him as well. Remaining silent for a few moments, the bishop eventually looked away from the man and released a quiet hum. What is your God, Lee K? David blinked in response before a smile slowly spread across his face. Well, if you want to know, I'd be happy to tell you. Ritska managed to push his way through the crowd of pirates, either drinking or laughing amongst themselves until he managed to make it to the still present opening in the wall, spot where he could make out the form of Ash and the other saber stood outside, the pair seemingly enjoying a brief moment of silence together. Taking a deep breath, Ritska took a single step outside and into the open. Hey. Ash. Hello, Ritska. Ash answered back cordially, turning his head to the side to stare down at the master. Was there something you needed? It's a bit of need to know and want to know. Ritska admitted with a strained look. You were pretty vocal in your dislike of Drake. Ash's expression tightened before the saber looked away from him, releasing a heavy sigh and moving their left hand up to cradle their face. Oscar looked between the two of them before taking a step back. I will move inside. He walked past Ritska before stopping and looking down at the younger boy. His face turned into a patient smile. I will ensure none disturb your conversation. Thanks. The master nodded. I'm Fujimaru Ritska, by the way. Oscar of Astora. The knight nodded back. I look forward to journeying with you, Fujimaru of Ritska. The master furrowed their brows at the title before the knight disappeared through the hole and back into the tavern. Fujimaru of Ritska. The boy parroted the words back to himself with no small degree of confusion. It is naming conventions. Ash explained with a breath of humor in his voice. You typically name yourself and the land you hail from when making introductions. I suspect Oscar was confused as to why you gave him your full name. You don't do that. I have never encountered a person who did. Ash shrugged. It is simply how things are. The saber soon exhaled lightly, but you wanted to ask about the woman. Captain Drake. HMPH. Ash grunted. Captain. The word implies a sense of duty, none of which I have seen from her. Okay. Ritska slowly nodded, walking until he was stood next to the saber. I gathered you don't like Drake because she's greedy. She is nothing but greedy. Ash rebuked with a frown. He clicked his tongue. Is greed commonly practiced? Do you want an honest answer? Ritska asked with an apprehensive look, because I get the feeling you won't like the one I give you. Ash released a sigh. My issue isn't with personal desire itself. I have also done acts because I wanted to at the time, but they are few and far between. Emerald eyes flicked down to Ritska, and none of them interfered with my duty. Are you upset Drake wasn't willing to help the Singularity? Ritska honestly asked, or because she knew something was wrong but wanted to enjoy herself? Neither. Ash snapped. Both. It is a type of behavior that none would participate in. He paused, then looked out across the horizon. She was aware something was wrong and she did nothing. He looked down at Ritska. Is that something you would practice? If you went back to Chaldea and ignored everything just so you could indulge yourself, could you call that right? No. Ritska replied instantly, then winced at how it sounded. Wait. Our situations were not dissimilar. Ash nodded his head. Both of us were forced into a position where we must save our respective worlds. But it's survival. A basic duty to keep living and to ignore it for. He turned around and leveled a strong look of distaste at the pirates, for that. He sighed, if she had told me her plan was to eventually solve the singularity, I wouldn't have cared. But she didn't because it was fun. Ritska realized, she's nothing but greed. He parroted the words with a look of understanding. A creature of habit. Ash scoffed, she's only helping now because it sounds fun, as if a duty to ensure the world does not burn to dust is something that one can just carry out because it happens to sound pleasing. As if a situation like that is one you can derive enjoyment from. Ritska frowned at Ash, but, haven't you had moments where you enjoyed yourself? Ash stilled, slowly turning down to stare at Ritska. I've done nothing but kill since I was risen, forcibly, from my grave. I helped people because it was something I felt was right. He tightened his expression, that does not mean I enjoy it. He paused, but if you are asking me if I have had moments where I enjoyed myself, I cannot give you a proper answer. Why? Because I do not even know what fun is. Ash replied with a tired voice. I smile, I laugh at times because it is something that brings warm feelings to me, but is that really what fun is? The saber tilted his head. I get those same warm feelings when I'm not violently killed, is that fun as well? The genuine look of innocent confusion while asking the rather disturbing question had Ritska freeze on the spot. How in the hell was he supposed to answer a question like that? Ash saw the troubled look on the master's face, his own expression composed itself before he spoke again in a calmer voice. Regardless, I will work with her if you ask me to. I've worked with worst, but Patches also understood that greed was a vice best left alone. His eyes drifted back towards Drake. I am beginning to understand why he thought so. Ritska remained silent, slowly turning around and walking back towards the tavern. Ash had certainly dropped some heavy conversation points on him. Worse, Ritska thought he had finally understood something important about Ash. They were certainly similar to each other, if what Ash had said was true. Ritska had also been forced into the master position and told he was the only one who could solve the singularities. If he was being honest, he could understand a bit of Ash's feelings, if not as strongly. It was a little baffling how Drake could so easily dismiss the singularity as an issue because it was fun to live on these seas and then just as easily switch to help fix the singularity because it sounded fun to end them. He paused, looking over his shoulder and back to Ash's figure. I assume your talk went well. Ritska released a small squeak at the soft voice, spinning around to see Oscar leaning against the wall with a reassuring smile on their face. I apologize if I frightened you. You seem to be deep in thought, so I am left to guess that your conversation with Ash went well. Well, Ritska parroted with a tight frown. It went, he replied honestly, looking back towards the saber. As for how well, I think I learned a bit about him. That looks tells me it troubles you. Oscar pointed out. I will not ask you the details, that is not my place. Although I would recommend speaking to another you share a closer connection with, if you are concerned about his mind. The knight grimaced, leaving a trusted ally alone to their troubles is not something that one should do. Right, Ritska absently nodded along with the words, flashing the knight a faint smile. I'll do that. Thanks for giving us privacy, by the way. Oscar gave a small bow of the head in response. I am pleased that I have provided some aid to you, if only partly. The knight raised his arm and gestured further into the crowd. I would recommend returning to your allies, they might begin to worry if you have departed from them for too long. Ritska gave a wry smile in response. Probably right, he looked around the chattering pirates. Livelier than I'm used to. A soft chuckle escaped Oscar. The same is quite true for me as well. There he is. Ritska stumbled as an arm suddenly wrapped itself around his shoulder and suddenly pulled him to the side. Where he then found himself almost smothered in something soft before his brain caught up with what happened. Come on, kid. Drake's barely sober voice echoed through his ears as he was pulled along towards the center of the room. You're gonna be sailing with us, so that means you got a drink. Wah, Ritska sputtered as he felt his eyes widen. I'm under AG. Under what? Drake squinted at him, not hearing what he said before shrugging. Doesn't matter if you're under the weather. Drink is good for cleaning wounds, so it'll sort out whatever's wrong with you. No. Ritska tried to argue as he was pulled along. I mean, I'm not allowed to drink. Not allowed. Drake sounded personally insulted. That the blonde guy again. Well, he ain't here now, kid. She shoved him into a chair in front of a table before slamming a mug in front of him. So enjoy yourself. But drink up. Drake encouraged with a wide grin before her expression turned serious. Trust me. It's better to forget everything that went wrong with some booze. Ritska stared at the mug and then looked around to see if he could find any support. Archer was in the corner of the room with his eyes closed. Boudica was trying to get Mash to not drink something. He was quite envious of the support the girl was receiving, and Havel was still talking with David about something else. Ritska stared at the booze in front of him and then looked up at the faces of all the grinning pirates before he steeled himself. It couldn't go that bad, could it? I hate the sun, Ritska muttered out as he covered his eyes, his arms resting on the table in front of him. Ash stared at him with a raised eyebrow. I'm not sure how to take that comment. Yura. Ritska stumbled away from the table and towards the corner of the room before retching. None of the pirates gave him a second look, considering they had seen such things many, many times before. Mash quickly jogged up to the master and began to pat his back repeatedly to try and comfort him, holding a concerned look on her face before she looked around to see where Boudica was. Immediately spotting the red-haired rider with a less than pleased look on her face as she berated Drake. Boudica's loud voice, in conjunction with Drake's own minor hangover, seemed to elicit a response from the pirate in the form of a pained wince. I don't believe this. Olga grumbled into her hands, peer-pressured by pirates. It's a powerful thing. Roman shrugged, can happen to anyone. Where were all of you? The woman ignored Roman and pointed around at each of the servants through the screen. What happened to taking care of your master? I would point out he had already consumed 2 mugs by the time I realized what was happening. Archer replied with a frown before a sigh escaped him. After that I did get him away from the alcohol, but it seemed to be too late at that point. What about you? She snapped towards Ash. What's your excuse? I wasn't in the room at the time. He replied, and I thought Mash would still have been with him. Mash was trying not to get drunk at the time. Boudica answered in response as she approached the group. I don't know where you were. She narrowed her eyes at Havel. The berserker looked down at her before David flashed a smile. I was informing him of Judaism. The archer exclaimed with a proud smile. I think the results went well. Oh my goodness, Roman's head fell into his hands. Are you seriously trying to convert him? Oh no. David replied without missing a beat. He was just curious about God, so I told him what I could. Havel shrugged. Noth. Ing. Spec. IAL. All right then. David scratched the back of his head. The results weren't that bad. If it please you. Oscar stepped forwards. I shall take responsibility. I was already aware of the captain's inclinations towards alcohol and was present when she collected Fujimaru of Ritska. The blame for his current state is mine. You aren't even his servant. Olga countered, so you had no reason to do anything for his well-being. She waved a hand at the others. It's these ones at fault. Her eyes fell on Ritska in the corner of the room with a scowl. We can't have him running around like that. It's a disgrace. All right. Ash moved his hand to his box, pulling out a small bottle with golden leaf ornaments clinging to the glass and moving towards Ritska and Mash, holding the small bottle out to them. Drink this, you'll probably feel better. Ritska made a noise as he took the bottle from Ash and removed the lid before drinking it. The clear liquid passed through his lips and down his throat before the boy widened his eyes, blinking them repeatedly and taking the bottle away from his lips. Whoa, that was. What did you just give him? Olga inquired with narrowed eyes. Holy water blessed by the Queen of Lothric and Goddess of Fertility. Ritska froze on the spot while Mash's eyes darted towards the bottle before her skin turned slightly white. Ash-san, would that not make it valuable? I suppose. Ash shrugged. I have 3 more. You. Olga sputtered. You gave him something like that to cure a hangover. Ash jolted at the manner in which her tone froze over. Roman to the woman's left slowly wheeled his chair away until he was out of frame. Was I not supposed to? Olga exhaled, her hands covering her face for a few moments before they slowly lowered themselves. From now on, refrain from using heavily blessed items from divinities until we've had a look at them. Her eyes turned to Ritska and ignited. And you. The next time you do something as stupid as that, I swear I will. Da Vinci-chan interruption. The screen switched over until it was Da Vinci's grinning face. Hello everyone. I could tell you were all missing your resident beautiful genius. Havel let out a noise of disgust and quickly marched out of the room. Da Vinci's face froze for a few seconds before it flattened out. Well, clearly someone has no appreciation for beauty. Sighing, she shook her head. Anyway, I'm looking at some of these readings and I'm happy to say, Mr. Protagonista, that you've never looked healthier. Ritsuko was still staring at the bottle in his hands before he looked towards Da Vinci with slightly panicked eyes. I just drank priceless holy water. You did indeed. Da Vinci grinned, leaning forwards with an expectant look on her face. How did it taste? Like water. Oh, well, that's a little boring. Da Vinci frowned. They should add some taste to it. Like peppermint. Snapping her fingers, she grinned. That would be nice. What if they don't like peppermint? Ritsuko found himself asking before he could stop himself. Da Vinci stared at him with blank eyes. What if they don't want to be cured of their ailments? Okay. Hey, Drake shouted out as she barged past the group and towards the door. Best get ready, we're gonna set sail soon. She paused and then looked around at the servants. Oh, by the way, if you're sailing with me, you've gotta play the part of my crew. That means you gotta do what I say. Something looked as though it died behind Ash's eyes. And, we're gonna be off towards the seas. Also yes. Bedrick is, in fact, dead. He was killed in the prologue to Chaldea's arrival to Okeanos, that's why there's an island missing. So no chosen undead here. Felt like I should clarify that. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Unwelcome commands. The hustle and bustle of pirates moving about on deck did little to Ash. In actuality, it meant very little to him. He'd never scrubbed a deck before now. He'd never cleaned anything except the blood from off swords and armor, and there was very little difference. At least he figured that would be the case. So when Drake had ordered him to clean the deck, Ash had obeyed. He obeyed because he was used to performing tasks he was told to do, his own personal feelings on the matter aside. He was told to clean the deck, so he would clean it. When you've done that section, you need to head into the crew quarters. Drake commanded as she walked past him, barely passing him a glance. They're starting to stink something nasty. Ash grunted in response. He didn't look at her and she barely looked at him. Although Drake paused in her movements at the complete lack of a response, a frown came to her face as she turned down to stare at the saber cleaning the decks. It didn't make sense to her. Up until a few hours ago he'd been giving her the stink eye, but the second he was commanded to do anything, the attitude dropped and he was away to perform the duties. Either he was very good at burying his feelings about her, which he obviously hadn't been, or he had completely ignored them the second he was ordered to do anything. She shrugged her shoulders. The other two had been like that as well. No one liked cleaning the captain's cabin, but they still did it after a little bit of grumbling. The real problem she'd found, however, was the big guy. Come on now. David tried his best to calm the large berserker. It's not that bad, everyone had to do it. Even me. He paused. I mean, it was horrible, disgusting and not something I would ever want to do again, but I still did it. Havel looked as though he was about to crush the chamber pot in his hands. The sheer rage which seemed to pour out of the man had long since scared away anyone else from that particular area of the ship. All right, I can understand how you might be a little offended. I killed dragons, Havel menacingly growled. I was general in army of gods. His fingers began to tighten as a creaking sound alerted David to the metal bending under his grip. I will not clean shit. Okay. David nodded his head slowly. What about cleaning the armory? He offered. Got plenty of swords and that which need a polish. Havel paused. His fingers slowly uncoiled themselves from around the pot in his hands to reveal dent marks in the shape of his large hands in it. David winced. He knew that the captain would be less than pleased about it, but he figured that if she had an issue with it, she could try and take it up with the berserker herself. Captain's orders were one thing, but he wasn't going to risk dying over a chamber pot. That would be terribly embarrassing for him. He could just hope that Oscar would understand why he was no longer on weapon cleaning duty, although the man's sense of smell wasn't that good to begin with, so he had never complained about cleaning out the chamber pots. So it was a win-win for everyone. Especially for David, considering he wasn't about to die or get beaten up. Archer stared at the sorry state of the kitchen, with a grimace. It wasn't a very clean place in the least. Scratch that, it wasn't a hospitable place either. It was terribly managed. One would think that pirates would have had better sense with taking care of their food and organizing everything so that they wouldn't run the risk of losing anything. Mainly because of how valuable preserved food was when out on long voyages. But apparently just asking Drake to give them food and water had made them slightly indolent. He let out a heavy sigh as he tied the apron around himself and moved into the kitchen. He'd have his work cut out for him with trying to turn this place into something manageable. Do you want to organize the shelves or clean up the counter? He looked over his shoulder to see Boudica similarly preparing herself, because this looks like it might be a two-person job. Even for a servant. HMPH. Archer grunted in amusement, shaking his head and staring at the mess in front of him. I'll be sure to clean it thoroughly. You can organize the foodstuff they have on hand. See if we can't make some manner of organization from this. Boudica hummed in affirmation as she made her way towards the pantry, opening up the door and clicking her tongue at the lack of organization. Reminds me of home. That doesn't sound like a compliment. Archer grunted as he moved to try and find some water to wash everything down. The one advantage to Drake having a Grail was they at least had some on hand for drinking and cleaning. That didn't mean they did that latter often. He wouldn't have been surprised if the whole ship had smelt the captain's cabin the second the woman had flung it open and shoved both his master and Mash, along with Fu, being an unfortunate tag-along, inside and told them to clean it. It isn't. Boudica blandly replied. I did love the Iceni but they were terribly messy. Couldn't keep anything clean for more than an hour and to say nothing of their food preparations. She sighed. There's a reason I'm as good as I am. I got a lot of practice in. I can imagine. Archer dampened the cleaning cloth and brought it up to the side, soon wiping down the side of the countertop. I feel as though I should point out that perhaps we have taken the title of servant too literally as of late. Don't pretend it bothers you. Boudica's voice was tinged with barely concealed amusement at his remark. You took to that kitchen quite quickly. It needed help. Archer responded with a shrug. Talented as Sigward is, he can't be expected to cook alone for the eventual number of servants the master is likely to have at some point. It was necessary to establish an early work relation. The writer retorted in a droll voice indicating how little she believed him. Well, if I'm being honest, I wouldn't mind having Sigward here right now. If only because he'd be able to help us. Summoning a servant from Chaldea just to help stack shelves is an exorbitant waste of resources. Archer sighed. For the time being we shall make do with what we have. It is not as though we are the only ones in need of help. He let out a faint chuckle, and I suspect Master would be more demanding of help than either of us. Boudica gave an honest laugh at that, most likely. This is something foul. Ritska cringed, wiping water away from his eyes as he prepared to move another sack of rubbish. Why does it burn my eyes? I'm not sure, Sen. Mash coughed into her hand. Her face morphed into an ugly grimace. Senpei. Perhaps it is because of the lack of laundry products they had back in the 16th century. Why yeah. Ritska coughed. That's probably it. He sighed, raising his head away from the old clothes. Never thought being a pirate would be like this. Technically we're only temporary pirates, Senpei. Mash helpfully pointed out with a strained smile. Although I do not believe this is what we were sent here for. Sorry Mash. Romani's voice came through the communicator. There's not a lot we can do for you back here. He paused, although the good news is that Da Vinci was working with the summoning system that Ash and the others from his world use, so we might get another quick type summoning that doesn't use your shield. We're still working on the details. Olga quickly added on before they could get too enthusiastic, and we will likely need the aid of a caster from the other world if we hope to make rapid progress. Although it is still within acceptable rates of assimilation, considering it is an entirely new system Da Vinci is trying to understand. She is a genius at the end of the day. Romani sighed, and she'll take every opportunity to remind you of it. Anything happen in Chaldea while we've been here? Ritska asked with an overly enthused voice, trying to distract myself from. His voice suddenly trailed off before he spoke again with a noticeably crack in his tone. Mash. Yes, Senpei. The shielder asked with concern at the way the boy was frozen, hunched over another pile of clothes. What's wrong? Are old clothes normally? The boy sounded very tired all of a sudden. Did they normally have pulpous material in them? Pulpous. Romani muttered to himself before his eyes widened and his face screwed up in disgust. Olga released a gasp and covered her mouth while looking away. Much of the command room did the same. Maxwell pinched the bridge of his nose while Carrie openly heaved in disgust. Munier's head fell into his hands. No senpai, Mash answered slowly with a growing look of horror coming onto her face. They don't. Fu waddled up next to Ritsuka and took a single sniff of the clothes he was near. The white animal then looked away from the pile with a frozen look on their little animal face, ever so slightly backing away from the boy. Ritsuka eventually released a sigh which seemed to take his soul with it. Yeah. That's what I thought. Tell Marcus to. Olga pat Romani's shoulder repeatedly with the disgust still on her face. Tell him to prepare some cleaning materials to send them, and some soap. All right, Romani nodded his head and tapped on the tablet next to him, sending the message to the supplies officer. Director. Ritsuka's broken voice came through the screen. Thank you. Really? His genuine gratitude had the woman slowly nod her head in response while maintaining her cringed look. She was grateful she was being thanked, but she'd rather it wasn't due to something like this. No one deserved this, and it was her role as director to ensure the staff were presented with the utmost dignity to befit their organization. This wasn't it. Strike that from the log. She hurriedly told Romani. The man blinked before looking at her in surprise. Really? But I thought we were supposed to note down everything. Do you want to write this down? She voiced in a hushed whisper. Romani stared into her eyes and slowly shook his head in response. Good. Me neither. By the time Ritsuka and Mash had managed to clean up the last of the mess within the cabin, it had already turned to sundown. At which point the general feeling was that the situation the boy had found himself in would never be brought up again by anyone in the control room or by Mash. Ritsuka was very grateful for that kindness. Dinner. Drake exclaimed as she burst into the mess hall. I'm starving. Settle down then and wait. Archer replied without missing a beat as he stirred the stew in front of him, Boudica already preparing bowls for the other members of the crew that had come in. The woman held a patient smile on her face as she dealt out equal servings amongst the members. Hey, Drake frowned, doesn't being captain let me cut in line? No. Archer's instant denial had the woman deflate and slowly make her way over to a table where she began to watch the queue slowly shorten. The thumps of footsteps heralded the arrival of Havel with David trailing just after him. Boudica looked up from her spot with a raised eyebrow. Where's Ritsuka and Mash? Havel stared at her for barely half a second before releasing a dismissive grunt which indicated just how little he actually cared. David was more helpful however, flashing her a trademark smile. I believe they are recovering from their cleanup of the captain's cabin. HMPH. Archer grunted, as long as they don't miss dinner and clean themselves up properly. The places where people eat should be kept clean. I feel called out. Drake rubbed her forehead. What is it with all you guys and laying into me for the littlest of things? The door to the mess room opened up once again. This time Ash's blank face entered and was soon followed by Oscar. The second arrival held a far more cordial look compared to Ash's one of ice. Drake stared at the second man with no small amount of confusion. I thought you didn't eat food. I cannot, I am afraid. Oscar affirmed, however I find that there is little substitute for sane company and should be enjoyed as often as possible. Didn't you spend most of your time at the docks? David pointed out. Oscar nodded immediately. I did not say that it was your company I was after. The man's answered back without missing a beat as he followed Ash to the corner of the room. I find the new arrivals much more agreeable, he voiced as he and the unkindled sat down away from everyone else. Drake huffed, I'm agreeable. Right. David looked away from her and scratched behind his ear. Havel slowly turned his head towards her in response. Helmet glaring down at her. ND, me, too, clean, she, T, Agai. N, the berserker growled with a restrained anger in his voice, and all, Brea, K, every, bone, you, have, with his warning delivered, he turned away from her and made towards the queue. Several men ducked out of his way as he approached Boudica. Stu, PLE, Ace. The woman in question blinked in surprise. Please. She repeated the word with no small degree of shock, considering who it was who had asked. She felt it was justified. Good, cook. Havel replied as if that were the only answer necessary. The writer looked to the archer for support. The tanned man offering nothing but a slight shrug in response before he went back to cooking. Boudica turned her attention back to Havel before pursing her lips. All right, but not cutting in line next time. She brandished the spoon at him as if it were a weapon. The berserker stared at her in complete silence before she released a sigh. Honestly, she half-heartedly grumbled to herself as she handed the bowl to Archer, who filled it up with the stew before handing it back to Boudica. Havel took the bowl and spoon with a surprising degree of gentleness before he stomped away to another corner of the room and sat down. The chair he was on creaked menacingly, and for a few moments the attention of everyone in the room fell upon the wooden chair, which looked as though it was a drop of water away from shattering. Somehow, and rather miraculously, the chair managed to hold its shape as the berserker began to shovel soup into his mouth through the visor of his helmet. A creaking turned the attention of the room back to the entrance of the mess hall. Ritska dragged himself into the room with a complete look of defeat in his eyes. Mash was staring at his back with a look of grief, while Fu sat on her shoulder sporting one of pity. The boy's expression made it perfectly clear that something had happened, but Ritska wasn't going to talk about it. He'd decided it was best that no one ever mentioned it ever again, and everyone agreed. The good news was that it hadn't been what he suspected it was. The bad news was that it was still vomit. Which was disgusting in its own right. "So you clean up my cabin?" Drake asked with a raised eyebrow. Ritska paused in his walk before slowly turning his attention to Drake and giving her an empty smile. "Why, yeah, we cleaned it up." He looked to the shielder. "Right, Mash?" "Yes, senpai." Mash nodded her head behind him. "We cleaned everything up. We even got Chaldia to send us some cleaning supplies." "Huh." Archer blinked in surprise while Boudica flashed him a victorious smile. "Wouldn't that be a waste of resources?" "No." Ritska shook his head, his eyes holding no life in them. "No, it wouldn't." He paused when he noticed the pair in the kitchen. "Can I get food?" "No cutting in line," Drake shouted out from where she was sat, soon scrambling to get up and rush towards the counter. "They seem lively." Oscar chuckled as he watched the captain barge past Ritska and Mash to get to the stew. "Certainly more so than I am used to, I admit." "I doubt that is difficult for us," Ash replied. The Astoran shrugged and turned back to the saber. "Perhaps, but I grew up in a small fishing village." Oscar recounted with a wistful smile. "We very rarely got visitors to my father's house unless it was for the market trade." "I've never heard about life from before," Ash admitted with a small look of curiosity. "What was it like?" "Very different from here," Oscar replied, "although I cannot comment for all of Astora and certainly not for the lands beyond." He chuckled to himself. "But it was a peaceful life. I learned how to fish from my father, all to help for the trade." Ash titled his head as he pointedly looked at the armor. Oscar gave a gentle huff of amusement. "Yes. Well," he shrugged, "I wanted to explore more of the world. Well, more of Astora really." His expression flattened out. "I wanted to find my duty. My purpose in the world, so I joined the Order of Knights." "Did you find it?" "Did I?" Oscar frowned. "I wonder. Perhaps I did find it," he admitted after a few moments, "but I did not complete it. I passed it on to another who carried it with him until the very end and saw it through." A dry huff passed through his lips. "More the fool I am. Even before I became undead I was always a step too short." Ash didn't reply to the man as he stared him up and down. Oscar blinked and looked back up at the unkindled with a slightly sheepish look. "Forgive me, I have allowed my musings to wander." He spoke in a distant tone. "I have not heard of Lothric before, perhaps you could tell me of it." "There is little to tell." Ash shrugged. "It is a kingdom that fell to ruin. Perhaps I lived there when I was still alive, but perhaps not. I am an unkindled. I was raised by the flame itself after I had already perished." "I see." Oscar quietly looked down. "Perhaps the fate of the undead was always known, a death that can never truly come even after hollowing." "Did you?" "I did." Oscar nodded, looking down at his hands. "It is a strange thing to be back, having remembered losing yourself. I do not know if it can be repeated, and I fear the answer would only cause me grief, but I suspect I know it." An empty smile came to him. "I sense you know as well, given that neither of us are capable of taste, I should think." "I do not know if I can go hollow." Ash replied. "Perhaps I cannot, or perhaps I can. I believe that it is my connection with Ritska that keeps me sane. As a servant I am bound in my duty to serve him, so I cannot lose sight of that goal. I am envious then. Oscar spoke honestly, to have a duty you know you can fulfill and never lose sight of. I do not know if it is something to envy. Ash frowned, looking down at the table. We unkindled are different from you undead. We know our purpose from the very moment we are risen. We all have a shared goal that we must fulfill, and if we turn away from it, we will become hollows. It does not sound dissimilar to being an undead. No, but imagine being told from the moment you awaken you already know that your best wasn't enough to begin with. Ash exhaled, and that ahead of you lies a more daunting task to complete than when you lived. Not that I had much of a choice anyway. I would either fulfill my duty and find some way to return the Lords of Cinder to their thrones, or I would lose myself to hollowing. What kept you going? Oscar asked. I do not believe I would have the strength for such a task. Strength. Ash frowned. It was not strength, it was simply that. I was asked to do it. He shrugged. So. I did. It does not matter how invested I might have become afterwards, it will always be because someone asked me to do it. He looked into Oscar's eyes. I was told from the very beginning what my duty would be, so who am I to question it? Who indeed? Oscar hummed in response. Perhaps it was simple perseverance that saw you through. Either way, it was a quality I lacked. He looked back towards the others in the room. It does not get any less strange to see them with such notions about them. Self-indulgence was not something I practiced even before I became undead. It is strange, and I will tolerate it if I am forced to. Ash pursed his lips. But that does not mean I will ever understand it. Although I have never attempted to indulge myself, and whenever the notion came to me it was swiftly stamped out. Why? Ash gave him a knowing look which caused Oscar to nod his head in understanding. Never mind, I believe I understand the issues that presented themselves. Quite frequently too. Ash exhaled. Do you think it is somehow rewarding for them? I do not know. The knight answered honestly while shrugging his shoulders. I cannot imagine how it would be, but I have never put much stock in material gains before. Me neither. Ash admitted. I collected many trinkets, but they were all useful, at least in some capacity. A bottomless box? Oscar inquired. Ash let out a hum of affirmation. I see, I only ever acquired a small one in the past. Although it saw me through many troubles. A sheepish look came to his face. I will admit that I never acquired much for it, and aside from my equipment it was not used often. That's not much to be ashamed of. I found that I had specific equipment I would frequently use. He winced. I have foregone my usual sword for its ability to catch fire. Oscar stared at him and then looked around the wooden room they were in. Yes. I can see why you would. He chuckled. That would present quite the issue if you were to swing it in the wrong direction. I can already tell that I would be quite clumsy in regards to such a weapon. I am a pyromancer as well. I know very little other magic. Ash admitted. It has limited me to my other tools at hand. He paused before adding on. Not that I am incapable with it, in truth I only used the onyx blade because I would not have to set it alight myself. The blade was enchanted with a flame of its own. It is often wise for undead such as ourselves to be partial to more than one variety of weapon. Oscar nodded his head in approval. I admit I have some passing skill with a bow, but it is nothing extraordinary. My own skill with a bow is likely nothing amazing either. Ash huffed, although when compared to Rash or Goff that is understandable. Oscar stared at him for several seconds, blinking repeatedly before he spoke again. When you refer to Goff, do you perchance mean the giant archer of Gwyn's legendary knights? I do. Ash nodded his head. We met him in our previous outing. As an archer I doubt there are many who could compare. Perhaps Ferris. Oscar offered with an almost giddy expression. His was always a favorite tale of mine when growing up. My father managed to purchase a hat made in the shape of his. The expression turned wistful. It is what inspired me to become a knight. Hearing of the tale of just an ordinary man who could compete with the gods themselves. Ash hummed in response. It does sound most interesting, and having seen the giant's skill firsthand it would take someone of great ability to equal him. Perhaps. Oscar's smile turned slightly empty. And they are far more fitting to be here than one such as I, he muttered in a quiet tone. So, David smiled as he slid down into a chair next to Havel. The large berserker paused for barely half a moment before the spoon disappeared into the helmet ports, replaced by a quiet slurping noise before the spoon re-emerged. How are you finding life on the ocean? Not great, Havel grunted in response. Not terrible. That's all right. David nodded his head. I suppose it might not be for everyone. You ever been on the ocean before? Yes. The berserker nodded as he moved another spoonful of food up to his helmet. Many. Tim. S. Oh. David blinked in response. Well, he moved his own spoon through his stew and towards his mouth. What was your ocean like in comparison to this? It's, and Havel's helmet tilted slightly. Scene 1. Scene, all. Feel like someone just said something that sounded wrong. Drake scratched the back of her head as she looked around the room. Probably nothing. Turning her attention back to the stew, she stared at it for a few more moments before she craned her head over to where Archer and Boudica were. Don't suppose I could convince you to become permanent crew members, could I? Boudica released a good-natured chuckle at the request. Archer grunted in response and said nothing more. I'm afraid we have prior engagements. Boudica offered with an appreciative smile, but I'm at least glad you enjoyed the food that much. Better than something I've eaten in a long time. Drake huffed. Normally fish and birds just appear but we can't make them taste good. Sounds as though it is the work of the Grail, senpai. Mash nodded her head in affirmation. Drake-san must have made some manner of wish to provide her crew with supplies. Really? Ritsuka blinked. Could it not also be the ocean itself? It's possible. Romani's face appeared over Ritsuka's shoulder wearing a thoughtful look, but... Excuse me, Captain Drake. Huh. Drake looked over to Romani and squinted her eyes at him. You have a shallow look about you, sir. She drawled out with a frown, cowardly, gutless and pessimistic to boot. A good man though. Yeah, I hate people like you the most. Romani blinked once before his head fell into his hands. One of these days we're going to meet a servant who doesn't insult me to my face. I don't think Ash-san insulted you, Doctor. Mash offered. Romani looked up and blinked once before a hopeful look came to him. He didn't. He cheered. Hey, Ash. Huh. The unkindled looked towards them from across the room, Oscar doing so as well. Yes. Thanks for not insulting me. You're welcome. Ash blinked and looked to Oscar. The man shrugged in response, before turning back to him. Was I supposed to? I've noticed most of the other servants we encountered seem to do so. Why? Oscar scrunched up his face. Is there some issue about him that seems irritate the eye? I don't really know either. Romani sighed, shaking his head. Anyway, back to what I was going to ask. Did you begin encountering supplies for your crew before or after you acquired the Grail? After. Drake nodded her head. Why? That settles it. Romani nodded his head. Would you ever wish for treasure? What? Drake looked as though she sucked a lemon. What's the point of having treasure if you don't put work into getting it? Romani hummed in response. That means your first priority would have been for food and shelter for your crew, basic essentials so that you could live out here. He sent Ritsuka and Mash a knowing smile, which means that her wish was probably for bountiful seas and water that she could exploit. Huh. Ritsuka blinked once. Well, that makes sense. So we don't need to worry about resupply. It would be practical to take advantage of the current situation. Olga's voice appeared behind Romani. The man turned his chair to the side and pushed it back to allow her to appear in the frame. That fiasco with the goddess Artemis. The Wah, Drake sputtered. Managed to lose us nearly 20% of our food reserves. She paused before cringing. Given that the servants have also taken to eating some of the food, it would be best that we continually stock up per singularity we visit. So, grab some fish or something while we're here. Ritsuka guessed. The director nodded her head in response before looking to Drake. If you have no problems. As long as you catch it. Drake crossed her arms. Whole point of it. You help catch it, you can do what you like with your share. Fair enough. Ritsuka nodded to himself. Gonna have to be a lot of fish. Sometimes we get big ones. Drake replied with an amused smile. Ritsuka and Mash froze while Olga blinked several times. Big ones. The director repeated with a hint of dread. What do you mean, big ones? I mean big ones. Drake looked at her as if she'd said something stupid. Biggest one we caught was, She furrowed her brows in thought before looking across the room. Hey. What was the biggest fish we caught? Half the size of the golden hind. One of the pirates answered back. although apparently there's a big fish with loads of heads living out near where the big city used to be. He shrugged, although that's what Pete says and Pete is an idiot. Drake frowned. We talking Patchy Pete or Pete with one leg? One leg. Drake clicked her tongue. Yeah, surprised he's still alive. See, can we just go back a second? Mash stuttered, do you mean there's a hydra living in the ocean? A clunk of wood turned everyone's attention over to Havel. The berserker's helmet was facing them fully. Hi, draw. He growled out in a menacing tone. It's a sea monster with loads of, Romani offered before Havel cut him off with a growl. I know what hydra is. The berserker slammed his hand onto the table and rose to his feet, spinning around and marching towards the exit onto the deck. I'm going. Going. Ritska blinked at him. Going where? Hun. Ting, Havel answered immediately. It took Ritska barely a second to infer the meaning behind the statement before he quickly shot to his feet with a panicked look. Wait. He rushed to block the door, spreading his arms wide. You want us to drop everything and rush off to kill a hydra? Yes, was the immediate answer he received. Mo. Vey. Hang on here. Romani's face appeared behind the master. A hydra is a high-level phantasmal beast. They have poison that would instantly kill a normal human being and would probably cause even a servant to suffer. And, Havel tilted his head, all more reason to kill. We're not going monster hunting on my ship. Drake called out from where she was sat. Damn if I'm going anywhere near something like that. She beats up Poseidon but decides a hydra is too much for her. David gave a wry smile. That's fair enough. Even I'm feeling a bit anxious about doing something like that. It took the likes of Heracles to kill one of their more notable members. See. Ritska pointed over to David. We don't have Heracles. I didn't know Hydra breathed poison. Oscar whispered to Ash. I thought they spat water. I don't even know what a Hydra is. Ash whispered back. Some sort of sea creature. Think of a dragon without wings and multiple heads that lives in the water. Ash thought for a moment, then his lips thinned. I see. Did you ever encounter one? Thankfully no. Oscar shook his head. I happened to hear of it from a traveling companion. He replied, eyes shifting away slightly. He killed two, I believe. Apparently they are also larger than most dragons as well. Ash nodded his head, turning towards the others. I concur. Until we have reason to seek out and slay such a beast, it is best we continue on our current course. He paused for a few moments before he looked to Ritska. Although I will support whatever choice you make. Right. Ritska pinched the bridge of his nose before giving Havel a steady look. We're still searching for clues to the Grail and we don't know if there even is a hydra about to begin with. It was apparently a rumor from A. He looked to Drake. How credible is the source? Pete once told everyone he could walk on water. Drake replied with a bland look. Problem is he once tried this when there were sharks about the ship. Reason we call him Peg Leg Pete. Okay. The source comes from an idiot. Ritska affirmed to himself. That's a bit mean, senpai. Mash gave him a slightly chiding look. Ritska only shrugged in response. It's also accurate. Boudica voiced out. Probably should consider himself lucky he didn't end up dead. Regardless, even if there is a hydra there, it's not like we can, fight it all that well. Ritska went on. If it breaks the ship we're all going into the water and some of us aren't as good at floating as others. He pointedly looked at Havel's armor and then back to the berserker's head. Havel remained silent for a few moments before they grumbled. Fie. Nay. The berserker turned around, moving back towards his table before pausing and looking over his shoulder. Well, wait, were his parting words before he placed himself back where he was originally sat. David remained in front of him with a blank look before shifting his gaze over to the others and offering a supportive smile. I notice he said he'd wait rather than he'd drop it. Romani whispered to Ritska. The dark-haired boy gave a small sigh of acknowledgement. I noticed that as well. Lowering his arms back to his side, he moved back over to where Mash was. We'll probably be made to go hydra hunting or something, won't we? It isn't as though it's not necessary. Romani cringed as he spoke. A phantasmal of that level would have been extinct by now, and while without the Grail it wouldn't normally be able to manifest at all and be forced out of the world. Its presence could lead to a minor disturbance in the timeline. So a tiny singularity. Ritska guessed. Romani nodded his head in affirmation, which caused the boy to release a groan. That's typical. Although Havel will be pleased, won't he? Looks as though he will. Romani frowned, although he referred to the Hydra as a dragon, which is odd considering they are only similar in the sense that they are both phantasmals, unless Hydra and dragons are different where they come from. As long as we're not being immediately dragged off to go completing Herculean labors. Ritska joked with a wry smile. Still, would be a heck of a boast, wouldn't it? You want to complete the other 11 labors then? Romani raised an eyebrow at him. Ritska paused and slowly shook his head. Leave it at just the one. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, probably for the best. Besides, I don't think that the director would approve of me doing something like that. Depends on if it's necessary. Olga's voice called out, sounding more dispassionate than anything else. Also, materials acquired from phantasmal beasts are quite rare and would no doubt be useful to some of those in the clock tower. It might be able to buy us a small bit of leeway in the inevitable inquiry that will be launched. You want us to bribe the clock tower lords? I said incentive, not bribe. Olga dryly retorted, you can't bribe them, but we could at least make it look as though we were able to exploit our poor situation to some benefit, otherwise we're all going to be lynched. Her eyes darted to the side as she nervously played with her hair, not that they'll give me much leeway. Director. Mash whispered to the hologram. The woman jolted and turned her attention to the shielder. It might be best we don't mention the clock tower around Havel Sand. He might get annoyed. Olga paused, then cringed when the thought came to her head about how Havel would respond to the knowledge of the clock tower's existence. Especially the knowledge of how many of them behaved. Havel had already shown himself to be barely tolerant of some of the more benign members of Magi society. Ash stared up at the night sky. It had already passed the point where most of the crew members had retreated to their own quarters and gone to bed with only a few still awake. One of those being Oscar, considering the undead saber couldn't sleep to begin with. Although there were the other servants, with the exception of Mash and David, the latter because he just wanted to sleep and felt he had worked enough during the day, who were also awake and moving about the ship as well. Drake had described them as the night crew, not that Ash cared what she called it. He wouldn't call his current position demeaning, but it was slightly beneath his skill set. Moving towards the bow of the ship, Ash placed his hands on the railing and looked across the ocean with an indiscernible expression on his face. Beautiful, isn't it? His expression twitched when he heard Drake's voice behind him. The unkindled looked over his shoulder to see her stop a few meters behind him with a faint smile on her face as she directed her eyes upwards. Rarely get tired looking at the night sky. HMPH. Ash grunted in response, turning his attention away from her and back out across the ocean. You don't like me much, do ya? No. At least you won't deny it. Drake snorted to herself. Hate people like that. Smile one moment and then the next they slip a dagger in your back. Although I suppose that's just how people can be. I know. He had enough experience with Patches to know that not every smile directed at you was genuine. Despite it all, the man had still been something of a consistent source of both aid and problems. However, that was simply how it worked with Patches. He lived for the next day and that was it. It wasn't grand, it wasn't glamorous, but it was simple. And it had worked for him for a long time. Really. Drake didn't sound as though she believed him. You seemed pretty vocal about how you expected me to act. Differing circumstances. Ash replied back, they all had duties of their own to fulfill, how should I care how they go about it? That's a pretty crappy lie. Drake scoffed, you're not much good at hiding how you feel. Wear your heart on your sleeve. Ash looked down at his arm, frowning before turning his attention back to Drake with a confused look. The woman blankly stared at him for a few moments before she cackled, shit, you're terrible ain't ya? Ash clicked his tongue and looked away. Fine. I disliked some of their duties or the way they carried them out, but that does not take away from their devotion. At the very end, at least they believed in something. Sounds like that got them dead. It got everyone dead, as you put it. Ash huffed. It kept them sane for the most part. That was more important than being alive. Really. If you're sane you can at least come back. Ash glanced over his shoulder at Drake. You lose sight of that and you slowly lose your sanity. Chasing after trinkets or treasures only to lose them. Drake rolled her eyes. Oh boy, so now me being a treasure hunter bothers you. It's the fact you live for nothing besides your treasure that bothers me. Ash replied without missing a beat. It's wrong. 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 Ash nodded. It's unnatural and will only lead to ruin. There is nothing to be gained from it. Except treasure. Drake wryly pointed out, you gain that. And only that. Ash turned to face her, if you are nothing without your treasure then you are nothing worth mentioning. He grimaced, you exist to be a problem for someone else and that is all that can be said about you. Someone who hopes to achieve something greater will inevitably stand in your way and all you can offer as your counterpoint to them is, because I felt like it, his lip curled in disgust, what manner of life is that? Drake's expression remained blank as she stared at him for a few moments before she looked away from him. What do you see when you look out there? Ash raised an eyebrow at her before following her gaze. The ocean. Anything else? No. And that's how I can tell your life ain't worth it. Drake shrugged in response, you see nothing but a load of water. Me. I see possibility. It's not just the treasure that's out there, it's the journey to get the treasure. She chuckled, if I saw just getting treasure as my duty as you put it, I'd be a poor captain. That's why I live for me. Otherwise I wouldn't be sailing the seas. I'd be a woman who captains a boat in the middle of an expanse of water. Those are the same thing. They aren't. Drake shook her head, but you can't see that, because you've never stopped to enjoy the moment, have you? Ash stared at her for a few moments before he looked away. There was never anything to enjoy. Oh, I'm sure there was. Drake snorted, but you never had the opportunity to take advantage of it. Ash said nothing in response, still staring at the ocean, eyes glinting as if he was searching for something upon the horizon. He saw nothing. He couldn't decide if that made him feel better for not vindicating Drake or worse. He moves without real passion. Everything he does is because he's been told. It's not as though he has a true will of his own. It's all because he was told. It's all because he was told. Is that really something that could be called a life? It's without joy, sorrow or anger. It's just nothing. What's that you do with your face whenever I come back? He asks one day, it's nothing important. He just catches it whenever he enters the shrine. The woman in black tilts her head. Does it offend you, my lord? No, he denies, but it troubles him greatly. Because it doesn't make much sense to him. He knows what a smile is but he doesn't know why she keeps doing it. He's only done what she has asked of him. It's nothing special. I am gladdened to see you return, my lord. He understands. He is one of the few unkindled who is still around willing to take up the duty. There are others. He's met some. So, you smile. I do, my lord. She admits it without shame or guilt. Thou art forever welcome home, Ashen One. Home. Is that what this place is now? Home. He looks around, it's ashen, cold and uninviting. Home. I see, he doesn't, but she thinks it is. It seems to bring some life into her being, more than his. So he'll allow her to think so. The smile he returns is one without emotion in it. She thinks it's home for him. So he'll think it's home for himself as well, as long as that makes her comfortable. Rise and shine. Ritska let out a yelp as he flung himself from the bed, spinning around and getting into a rather awkward fighting stance. A snort had him pause and turn his attention towards the other people in the room. Drake regarded him with a marginally amused look before gesturing with her thumb. Get above deck lad, we've spotted some land. Ritska flushed and nodded his head, moving to straighten out his mystic uniform and make towards the ladder onto the deck. The others were already getting up and moving ahead of him, although his mind still found itself falling back onto the dream he'd just had. A frown made its way onto his face. He recognized the woman, that was Cecilia. Which made it another of Ash's memories, although this one had been different from the others. It was colder, for lack of a better word. Something landed on his shoulder. Craning his neck to get a better look at it, he instead found himself staring at a ball of white fur. Morning foo. He chuckled to himself, reaching up and scratching behind the white animal's ear. The creature let out a pleased hum in response. Think we've discovered anything interesting? Foo tilted their head at him, letting out a small Q noise in response. Well, worth a shot at a guess anyway. Lower the sails. Drake shouted up. We'll take the rowboat out there. She marched through the deck before turning her attention to Oscar and David. You two stay with the ship. All right then. David agreed almost instantly. Oscar nodded his head in response but said nothing. Right then. She turned her attention away from the duo and to the small gathering of servants near the drop onto the rowboat. Hope you lot know how to use an oar. Her eyes fell on Havel. Probably best you The man faded away into motes of light, cutting off whatever she was going to say and causing her eyes to nearly bulge out of her skull and her jaw to snap shut. I think that means he'll travel with us. Boudica gave an amused laugh before looking down at the boat, probably safer for all of us too. But he ain't gonna be doing any work. Are you going to be helping? Ash gave the woman a bland look. Drake opened her mouth to retort before she slowly closed it. Fair enough, she replied with a small shrug before she looked over her shoulder. About time you two turned up. Sorry, Drake-san, Mash offered, I forgot to tell you Senpei was a heavy sleeper. I'm not that bad, am I? Ritsuka let out an indignant groan as he jogged over to where the others had already gathered. Where's Havel anyway? I believe only Sigward has you bested in sleeping. Ash replied with a faint smile, and Bishop Havel has returned to spirit form so as to not weigh down the boat. Ah. Ritsuka nodded his head, alright then. Drake stared at Ash in a weird way. Bishop? Yes. Ash affirmed, he is a bishop. I'd like to see someone try and tell him they won't go to his sermons. Drake snorted to herself as she climbed down the ladder. Hurry up then. Ain't got all day and there's probably treasure on that island. Ritsuka waited for Ash to make a comment. When he didn't, he looked over and just saw the saber with an irritated look on his face before it shifted into an expressionless gaze. Ash soon began following after Drake in climbing down the ladder onto the boat. Have you ever used an oar to row a boat, Senpei? Mash asked. Ritsuka shook his head. Nope, but it can't be that, he trailed off. I didn't say it, so it doesn't count. He instantly whispered to himself, it doesn't count, right? It probably does, Fujimaru-kun. Romani's voice called out over his communicator, sounding genuinely sympathetic, sorry to say. Damn it. Ritsuka clicked his tongue, never mind, let's just go then. Mash was left bewildered as to what the problem was, still looking around in confusion at the exchange, only to see Archer slowly nod his head as if he had heard some universal truth while Boudica gave Ritsuka an encouraging smile. For first-time oarsman you weren't that bad. Drake complimented with a slight shrug, not great but I'm sure you'll get better with time. HMPH. Havel grunted as he materialized, club resting on his shoulder and sideways towards them, helmet scanning the beach. Something strange. Can't fault his instincts. Drake let out a small huff, taking a deep sniff of the air. Yep. Air is different here. Her eyes narrowed, way too different to other shores. Really? Ritsuka blinked, taking a sniff of the air himself and frowning when he found nothing. It is. Drake waved his off. You tend to be able to tell these things when you sail long enough. Captain Drake is correct, Fujimaru-kun. Romani's rather astounded voice came over the communicator. There are mild differential readings in the atmosphere where you are now than compared to Pirate Island. Still, not calling it that. Havel grunted from where he was. Drake sent him a raised eyebrow. What do you call it then? Scums. Retreat. Drake remained silent for a few moments before she burst out laughing, clutching her belly and nearly doubling over. Ha ha ha. Ha 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 ha. Scums. Ha 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 ha. Wiping away a tear from her eye, she sent Havel a deeply amused look. Why yeah, that's pretty accurate. It must be a result of the singularity. Romani cupped his chin. Perhaps it is merging different seas together. If it is an assault on the age of exploration itself, then it would stand to reason that the entire period is being affected. That's a surprisingly intelligent deduction coming from you. Da Vinci's voice came from over the communicator. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Leo. Romani's flat voice replied, anyway, it's still pretty impressive that Drake would be able to tell the difference, but I suppose that's just the Eri, NCIS, Ujima, N. Roman. Ritsuka tapped his communicator repeatedly. You still there? He got only garbled static in response. A flat look came to his face as he turned to Mash. This is becoming commonplace, isn't it? Unfortunately so, Senepi. Mash gave a grim nod of her head. Perhaps something on this island is causing interference. Must be. Ritsuka nodded. Guess we'd have to get back to the Golden. A deep rumbling cut Ritsuka off as the ground suddenly shook beneath their feet. The master's eyes went wide as they lost their footing and fell flat on their face into the sand. The servants all assumed combat positions while Mash rushed over to Ritsuka. What was that? Ash looked around, hand resting on Storm Ruler on his back. An earthquake, perhaps. Boudica frowned. No, that didn't feel like one. Archer narrowed his eyes. It was the activation of a bounded field. He replied, looking around, a strong one too. Really? Mash looked over to Archer before squinting her eyes. Yes. I can feel it as well. It's a subtle pressure on my back. What's a bounded field? Ritska asked as he pushed himself out of the sand, dusting himself off and wiping his eyes clean. It would take some time to explain it properly. Archer replied, think of it as a spell which affects an area with a specific effect. In this instance, he frowned, I'm not sure. He turned towards the rowboat and slowly made his way over to it. He then raised his leg and gave the boat a light kick which normally would have been more than enough to push it off the shore. The boat didn't so much as move an inch. In this case it seems we're stuck here. Boudica surmised, do you think it covers this specific area or the whole island? Impossible to tell from here. Archer frowned, you'd need a caster for that. His eyes turned to Havel, can you dispel it? No, Havel shook his head, would need to be near origin. Archer slowly nodded his head, I thought as much. So, we're stuck here then. Ritska guessed with an already knowing look on his face. Seems that's the case. Drake rolled her neck, could try and get a message back to the Hind and see if they can. A blur crashed into the sand at the shoreline, soon revealing the form of David with a slightly troubled look on his face. So, I have some bad news. He started with, the ship is stuck. Drake blinked at him, then looked over his shoulder to see the Golden Hind with its sails raised but unmoving. What do you mean? The ship itself is fine, but it appears as though we fixed in place. For the time being, we don't seem to be going anywhere. David replied in a patient tone, sorry, Captain. Well, we're stuck here as well. She pointed towards the rowboat, for now I suppose we'll have to search this island for clues. You stay here and watch the ship in case anyone tries to come around and take advantage of us. Will do. David nodded with a casual look before turning back in the direction of the ship and pulling out his sling. Spinning it up he released several glowing green stones and hurled them across the water, jumping as they flew and seemingly riding them back towards the ship. I didn't know David could do that. Ritska blinked in surprise at the display. I didn't know either. Drake shrugged, oh well. Best prepare yourselves. She whirled around to face the island with a grin, we're going exploring. Terrific. Ash marched past her with a note of resignation in his voice, because that never ends poorly. And, we're onto the island of the goddess and one minotaur. That's going to be fun, also a nice little mention of a hydra lurking in the waters. Is it one from Fate or Dark Souls? Who knows? Well, I do, but that's beside the point. Next chapter is obviously going to be some casual conversations as they explore in an encounter with a ruin. Because all Dark Souls games inevitably involve someone skulking about a labyrinth. Looking at you, Sen.